I first noticed the sweetness of bread and citrus clinging to the air at Metropolitan Market as I eased a wicker basket of apples and pears onto the checkout counter and fumbled for the right bills. The cashier, a man with tired kindness woven into his face, studied my name on the card and asked if I was my son's mother. When I said I was Maeve Larkin, mother of Aiden, his fingers tightened around my wrist with an urgency that startled me, not unkind, but pleading in a way that made the fluorescent lights hum louder. He whispered that the family across the Narrows, the one my son had married into, came through buying the kinds of things working people admired from a distance and rarely carried home wine with foreign accents on the labels, steak wrapped in paper that murmured money trinkets from polished aisles. He said he'd overheard them praising the generosity of my son, how much he helped, how reliably he came through. He urged me to watch, to pay attention. He let go, as if he hadn't touched me at all, and resumed his practiced motions, the scanner's beep suddenly a metronome for the worry gathering inside me. I stepped into the gray Tacoma afternoon with the basket pressed against my ribs like a shield and walked until the loading bay swallowed the market's warmth and left only damp asphalt and the tang of cardboard. There by the lean of the wall and a row of blue recycling bins, I waited behind a chain-link fence for nothing and for everything. A pale SUV, new enough to gleam even under the drizzle, slid into a spot, and Victor Belmont climbed out with the smooth, unhurried efficiency of a man who had never had to apologize to a bill. He was not the weary father-in-law my daughter-in-law, Leela, described on late-night calls when she spoke of reduced hours, mounting expenses, a roof that begged for repair, and a body that begged the pharmacy. He lifted 2 glossy bags from the trunk, the kind of bags that remember the shape of a line of credit, then laughed into his phone about lower-level season tickets and promised to meet someone next week. The sound floated across the lot with careless ease. I felt the wall at my back as a brace and a rebuke. For weeks, I had believed a story that ran in the opposite direction of what lay in front of me, and I'd learned again the old bookkeeper's rule I'd preached to my younger self. Numbers rarely lie, but people can be very good at tutoring them to do so. I went home to my small apartment and laid the fruit basket on the counter like contraband from a truer country. I pulled out the ledger I've kept since Aiden was born, a habit forged in the years after my husband's accident, when daylight meant 2 jobs and the darker hours meant arithmetic with a pencil ground to the nub. I counted the thin pension that came once a month, the cash in an envelope marked emergency, the utilities that learned to take bigger bites each winter. I remembered the metal of bus fare coins warming in my palm, the sandwiches wrapped in wax paper, the dinners I swallowed slowly so my boy could believe I'd already eaten enough. Those years taught me to stretch without breaking. They also taught me that generosity is a good knife you must carry, with the blade sheathed. When Lila called, I unlatched the sheath again and again, a prescription missing from the Policia power bill, lunging toward the red, a landlord tapping a foot by the door. Aiden did the same, echoing the lesson I had meant to give him, that the right thing done quietly keeps the roof from sagging. I did not mean to teach him the cost of becoming someone else's endless answer. The next day, he picked me up to drive across the bridge, punctual as always, hands at 10 and 2 shoulders a little higher than I liked to see. We crossed the steel ribs of the Narrows, and the water below looked restless, a slate surface stitched by wind and tide, and the Belmont house waited with fresh paint, where Lila had promised postponements, a mended porch bark spread neat in the flower bed's chairs that still smelled of varnish. Inside, the couches had become leather with firm seams. The art on the walls had learned new names, and the dining table taught me how salmon glows when it arrives on a tray instead of a cast-iron pan. Every indulgence wore a small disguise. Employee discount, client points of favor owed, but the disguises did not cover the fact of ease. Aiden rubbed his temples as if his skull were a clock that needed winding. He smiled and agreed, and tried to be the man who harms no gathering by naming the thing that will ruin it. On the way home, I folded my suspicions into the same corner of myself where I hid my extra $20 bill. A few hours later, my phone lit with an unknown number and delivered photographs from a stranger who signed only as the market cashier, now named in my mind as someone I could not ignore. The photos were receipts ringing with indulgence imported cheese wine, tall enough to see the top-shelf cosmetics, with names that made me feel provincial. The totals stood inside fat circles as if to say they had learned to become the center of everything. The dates hummed with cruelty, falling a day or two on either side of Lila's calls for help. I set the phone down and then picked it up again. Proof is heavy. The choice to use it is heavier. By morning, I had tucked those printed pages into a plain envelope and slipped it beside my ledger, a schoolgirl's cheat sheet I loathed to carry. Aiden invited me to Point Defiance for a walk, and my yes was less about the trees than the chance to find a path through words. The park smelled of cedar and seawater. The gravel underfoot translated our steps into prudence, and gulls scavenged the edges of our talk. I watched the fatigue in my son moving like a weather front across his face. I tried a question that would not bruise, asking whether he ever felt the weight of another home pressing in too close. He answered with the gentle stubbornness that once made him argue bedtime at 10 years old, that family was not a weight, but a woven thing, and some threads simply made the cloth stronger. He could work more, he said, for a while. He could be the rope in a tug of war without resenting his palms. The envelope burned like a small coal in my bag. I imagined sliding it onto a picnic table and seeing my son look up at me with the same bewilderment he wore as a child. When he realized I could not fix certain breaks, could only stand beside him while he learned to do it himself. I failed to choose in that moment, and perhaps it was grace, because that night he called and asked me to come to the house. He sounded flatter than tired. He wasn't a man melting. He was a man who had been placed in a mold and cooled until he cracked. He set a spiral notebook on the coffee table and opened it to reveal a set of neat columns I recognized as the work of a careful mind. The dates ran down the page like a spine. Next to them were the requests Leela had made across the last year, translated into bullet points with amounts, escalation phrases, and reminders to herself about which story to use: her father's sudden hospital admission, a missed paycheck, a landlord who had lost patience. There were notes about me, too, about how to fold me into the plea, and an extra asterisk beside the phrase, "family comes first." The amounts mirrored the overtime periods my son had taken and the cash I had peeled from my envelope. When Lila walked into the room and saw the notebook open, she swung between outrage and honeyed explanation in seconds. None of it mattered nearly as much as the long quiet that followed before my son closed the covers. He said he wanted the truth spoken plainly, not over dinner, not surrounded by alibis pinned into furniture and framed photos, but out where everything becomes smaller under the size of the sky. We met them the next afternoon on the water side of Ruston Way, where gulls write rude cursive and waves teach you the rhythm of reconsideration. Lila came first with a smile that asked to be believed. Victor arrived dressed as if clothes were a language he alone remembered how to speak. Aiden anchored the notebook with a paperweight and placed the receipts beside it, and he asked his single question. Not "how could you," which invites a myth, but "is this what it looks like?" Their answers braided into each other. Discounts points, favors the old taxidermied fox named survival, and the more modern parable of doing what you must for security. My son did not summon anger. He simply presented contradiction and let it stand luxuries paired with emergencies. Indulgence yoked to please. The masks fell in different ways. Lila's broke under heat, Victor's dissolved on the tongue, and in one unguarded flicker, he admitted that reliability had been profitable. It wasn't personal, he said, as if that phrase were a balm and not a blueprint. Aiden's hands shook when he closed the notebook, and I saw in him the boy who learned to ride a bike by pedaling into his own balance. He said it ends here. Those 3 words felt like a sentence that breaks and frees in the same breath. The next morning, he asked me to sit with him in an attorney's office, built of worn brick and fluorescent patience. The woman explained that boundaries could be recorded as documents, pauses disguised as freezes on transfers, separations that allow a man to stand on his own floor again, new accounts that bear only his name. Aiden's signature looked like a small bird landing, and then learning how to leave. When we came outside, the city smelled faintly of rain and coffee. Victor called, as if the day had not yet changed, and asked for a bridge of money to cover the span to a check the size of a lie. My son pressed the phone onto the dashboard and spoke the same 3 words with a steadier voice. It ends here. In the weeks that followed, I returned my spare key to him, and he handed me one to my place. And in that exchange, our relationship found its adult bones. The door to my apartment was the same door, but the lock learned something new each night when I turned it, and the key learned to warm quickly in my palm. The summer planted itself in Tacoma with a stubbornness I trusted. Aiden moved into a light-flooded rental near Wright Park, where the windows admitted birdsong and the laughter of children learning to measure their joy in climbs and swings. He reclaimed habits that cost nothing and returned interest sleep long enough to remember his dreams. Walk without counting the blocks in dollars, cook on Sundays, and pack leftovers with the quiet pride of a man building a week that does not leak. He was pale, where exhaustion had sucked the color out of him, then less pale as the days accrued. There were hard hours too, of course, the ones that come when love fractures and leaves both grief and relief behind to argue over what remains. But his face began to relearn relief, and that was a language I had missed in our home. I repaired things at my pace too, not with paint on a porch, but with paper. I sat at the little table where my ledger keeps its orderly trust, and wrote a new will and a small bequest, marked for a Tacoma nonprofit that teaches older women how to watch their bank statements like shoreline gauges, because fraud is a tide that looks like water until your ankles are gone. I learned to keep my emergency envelope in a safer place, and I learned that safety, like mercy, begins with the word no spoken in time. When I thought of Lila and Victor, I worked to feel nothing more than the dull furniture of caution. Their names grew lighter each month, scudding farther out among the gulls, and returning only as lessons. If someone's story always requires you to pay admission, you are not a guest, you are the show. For a while, people asked what had happened the way neighbors do when grass changes and cars switch sides of the street. I said as little as possible. Beyond what was necessary for court silence, served my son's healing better than any rehearsed speech ever could. The neighbor across the hall, Beatrice Kwan, who tends African violets with the seriousness of a mother, brought me hot buns on Tuesdays and told me that age is mostly patience and the occasional firm hand. She said every community has a kind of watch, and that now it was our turn to take a few hours on the porch. I liked that. It felt truer than the brittle heroics of saving people who did not wish to stop drowning. I spent less not because I could not have spent more, but because spending had begun to feel like an old fever I'd carried too long. I replaced the habit of reaching for cash with the habit of reaching for the long walk along Ruston Way, where the gulls jeered the world fairly and the tide reported to no one. Every so often, I saw a pale SUV in the distance and felt my spine remember what it was built for. I let the feeling pass. The cashier from the market, his name I later learned, was Ellis Pike, sometimes nodded when our paths crossed in the parking lot. We never spoke about the day he touched my wrist. The gratitude I carried for him was too large to spend in a sentence. It grew better in the quiet. On a bright afternoon, Aiden and I returned to the market for apples and pears we would slice into a salad with lemon and honey, a small ceremony replacing the old one. of bringing a basket to a house where truth had been taught to dress better than it planned to behave. We took our turns at the register, then sat on a bench by the window as if practicing for a simpler life. He told me how his body no longer braced at the sound of his phone, how laughter sometimes arrived before duty, and how he was not done believing in love, but would no longer confuse sacrifice with surrender. I told him how money can be a story, and how we had the right to write a better one. For once, the ledger in my mind balanced without erasing compassion. Generosity didn't leave. It learned a new gait. On a Sunday, I offered to sort the box of papers that had followed him from apartment to apartment, like a faithful but messy dog. We sat on the floor, and I drew lines between the past and the possible, between the paid and the past, due between charity and a siphon disguised as kinship. He found photographs of camping trips and a menu from the Greasy Spoon, where he had proposed to a girl who wanted safety, and then tried to build it out of other people's roofs. He set aside what was worth keeping and handed the rest to the trash with a tenderness that made the simple act look like a prayer. In the evening, I walked home with a bag of peonies he had insisted on buying their pink, insisting on joy, even as their stems failed to brace such insistence. I put them in a jar and let their collapse be beautiful. There is a version of this story in which a mother makes a single phone call, and the problem ends. That version flatters the caller and erases the part where a son must decide what kind of man he will be when no one is watching. I did not write that version because life did not give it to me. What it gave me was a key, a ledger, an envelope, a walk, a notebook, a waterfront meeting, a quiet desk where signatures feel like promises, and a summer that kept showing up even when it rained. I carried all of that, and so did my boy, and somewhere along the way, the weight began to distribute itself more kindly. By autumn, the leaves at Wright Park burned into their brief, handsome truth, and then let go with a civility I envied. Aiden and I developed small rituals Tuesday Fio beneath the green awning that somehow holds back November. Saturday morning laundromats where heat and patience make their peace. Thursday calls where he tells me one thing he learned that week that did not belong to the past. He is saving again, not as a penance, but as a plan, and he is dating as if the word were an honest verb for two people learning whether their ordinary days can keep company. He does not list his kindness as capital or its constant exploitation as an inheritance. He speaks simply about boundaries, and in that simplicity, I hear the most expensive education a person can receive finally paying dividends. Lila's proceedings inch forward in the sober pace of court, and Victor's attempts at convincing anyone of anything grow rarer. People like that rarely disappear. They migrate. When their shadows fall across a different door, I hope the family inside has a watch like Beatrice's violets, like Ellis's quiet, like a ledger kept for decades by a woman who once measured bus fare in the warmth of coins and now measures safety in the sound of a lock turning home. I do not rehearse speeches about forgiveness. I practice something more modest and more exact. Do not confuse hope with the habit of being harmed. My apartment has learned to hold light longer each day, or maybe I have learned to notice it. The metal key on my chain rests against my skin and reminds me that love is not an open-door policy. It is a house with windows wide and a front lock that works. We still shop at the market. The cashiers change and remain as cashiers do, and I buy pears when I can and apples when I must. Sometimes the fruit carries a bruise I do not see until I slice it open on my small cutting board. I cut away what can't be salvaged and use the rest. The knife does not apologize for being useful. If there is any lesson I would hand to the people who have watched our story from the outside, it is this: generosity without discernment starves the giver first. The trick is not to stop giving, it's to stop giving where help only builds a softer landing for someone else's bad habits. I think often of that day in the loading bay when drizzle made the asphalt shine. Proof is heavy, I said to myself then. I would add now that proof does not need permission to exist. It simply waits for us to be ready to look straight at it. When the attorney slid the final paper across to Aiden later that winter, he signed without shaking, and the sound his pen made on the page was smaller than silence and larger than applause. We walked to the window and stared at a sky that wanted to snow and couldn't quite manage it. We didn't say anything. We didn't need to. The ordinary triumphs have no horn section. If you're watching this and holding the envelope of proof you're afraid to reveal, or the key you're afraid to reclaim, or the ledger you have delayed balancing because love told you arithmetic was unkind, let me say the kindest thing numbers will ever do is tell you where you stand. Start there. You will not be perfect, but you can be precise. Set one boundary. Say no once. Count again. Watch the people who love you adjust their steps to match. Watch the ones who loved the old arrangement fade. Your life will not become a movie. It will become a room you can breathe in. That is enough. If this story moved you, please, like to help it reach others. Share it with someone who needs a gentle nudge toward boundaries. Subscribe for more true-to-life stories of resilience and comment with the moment you chose dignity over pressure.